Shocking! China has stepped up for Lukashenko. She has turned against Putin and is preparing a forceful response. Beijing is now deploying its troops in Belarus. The Red Dragon's army is officially moving in right under Russia's nose. Beijing's iron shield against Putin's ambitions. The Kremlin's pressure on Minsk has angered China. Xi Jinping has issued a stern warning to Putin. The old man has found a protective roof. What or who is Lukashenko trying to hide from? What are China's ambitions for Belarus, and how is Lukashenko's youngest son involved in all this? You'll find out right now. Welcome to the Ukraine Today channel. I'm Andrei Silakov, and we'll discuss Lukashenko's curious balancing act. Putin's aggressive pressure, trying to force Belarus into direct combat against Ukraine, seems to have pushed China too far. According to an expert, Xi Jinping has openly and clearly signaled to Moscow that the sovereignty and independence of Belarus is a direct interest of China, where the Kremlin and its imperial ambitions are forbidden to interfere. An interesting turn of events, isn't it?
This message is by no means addressed to Kiev, which demanded the shutdown of military infrastructure helping the Russian army terrorize Ukraine. That demand has been fulfilled. The drone signal repeaters in the Ukrainian border area have been turned off. This message from China is for Moscow and Putin personally, who really wants to drag Lukashenko even deeper into the war. China is demonstrating that Belarus is its aircraft carrier in Europe. Fortunately, this aircraft carrier is not unsinkable, and everyone understands that, explained Alexander Klaskovsky, a political analyst for the independent Belarusian news agency Pozerk.
Analysts also openly state that China is rapidly increasing its strategic presence in the Republic and is preparing for the permanent deployment of its regular troops there. In effect, Chinese soldiers are moving in right under Russia's nose, turning Belarus into a sovereign PRC aircraft carrier, supposedly protected from the Kremlin's encroachments.
This is a way for Xi Jinping to counterbalance the growing presence of Euro-Atlantic democracies in the Indo-Pacific region. I believe all of this will lead to the permanent stationing of Chinese troops in Belarus. We must prepare for this. Even if it sounds crazy, 3 years ago everyone would have called me insane if I'd said North Korean troops would participate in the war against Ukraine on Russia's side. It is what it is.
However, by saving Lukashenko from being absorbed by Moscow, Beijing is pursuing quite pragmatic goals and won't miss the chance to squeeze maximum benefit out of Minsk. For China, Belarus is the key logistical hub on the way to the European market, which Xi will not allow anyone to destroy. As the analyst explains, the Chinese are methodically taking certain sectors of the Republic under total economic control, developing their infrastructure, and tying Minsk to themselves for good.
The expert emphasized that Belarus is very important for China, and Putin understands perfectly well that his power over Belarus ends where Xi Jinping's interests begin. And Xi Jinping's interests are everywhere there, he added.
One of the main hidden motives for these desperate vacillations of Lukashenko between Moscow and Beijing was Belarusian potash, the main source of foreign currency for his regime. After Donald Trump partially lifted sanctions on fertilizers to lower prices for American farmers, the Kremlin struck a preemptive blow, deciding to lock Minsk tightly in its grip.
The arrest of Ilya Traber and the forceful takeover of the port vertical by the FSB. This is the Kremlin's retaliatory preemptive strike. Moscow is clearly demonstrating to Lukashenko gray schemes, maneuvering, and backroom deals in the Baltic are over. Until the EU opens its ports, Minsk's potash exports are completely squeezed in the grip of Russian intelligence services, blocking any attempts by Lukashenko to play a separate game with Trump.
However, Lukashenko quickly found a counterweight to this archaic port blackmail dating back to the 90s. In Beijing, he guaranteed the sale of millions of tons of potash fertilizers to vast Asian markets, finally depriving Putin of his main lever of economic coercion. China is happy to take this strategic resource for itself, offering a powerful geopolitical shield in return. The backroom games of the Russian Chekists only led to Minsk fleeing in a panic under Beijing's total protectorate, leaving Russia with nothing.
China is the second largest buyer of Belarusian potash and views Belarus as a key hub of the Silk Road. For Minsk, the trip to the PRC is an attempt to find a political and financial counterweight to the Kremlin's pressure, guarantee potash sales to Asian markets, and get a geopolitical shield from Xi Jinping in case the conflict with Moscow enters a critical phase.
And an equally symbolic finale to this backroom deal was Lukashenko's visit to Peking University, where his youngest son Nikolai received a degree in biotechnology. It's no wonder Batka sent Kolya to study specifically in China. Now it's Minsk's main family and political anchor. Speaking at the ceremony, the dictator publicly jabbed the Kremlin, stating that his strictest condition was the return of all graduates of this program to Belarus. Even though the Russians, quote, had their hearts set on them, Batka literally took both valuable personnel and potash billions right from under Putin's nose, redirecting them under Xi Jinping's patronage. Is the era of Moscow's influence officially coming to an end? And has China taken Russia's main ally for itself? The comrade and sworn brother of the RF has urgently fled to China. After a tough talk at Valdai, Lukashenko dropped everything and rushed to Xi Jinping for protection. For Moscow, this has become a personal insult. If even Minsk is frantically moving under Beijing's protectorate, Putin's influence has finally hit zero. What happened behind closed doors, and how is China taking the RF's last satellite? Watch more.
He ditched Putin and went to negotiate with China. What happened during the talks between the old friends? Putin and Lukashenko spent 2 days behind closed doors, but after the meeting, something very strange happened. There were no traditional hugs in front of the cameras, no joint statements about brotherly nations. There wasn't even the usual parade of staged photos that for years were meant to show the world the unbreakable friendship of Moscow and Minsk. Instead, there was almost total silence, and for authoritarian regimes, silence after talks often says much more than dozens of official communiques. The thing is, right now, Putin doesn't need compliments or diplomatic bows from Lukashenko. The Kremlin needs Belarus as a military resource, as a territory, as a bridgehead, as another tool to continue the war. After Russia lost a huge amount of equipment, people, and time, Moscow is increasingly returning to the old idea of using the Belarusian direction for new pressure on Ukraine and at the same time keeping NATO's eastern flank in a state of tension. But it seems that this time Lukashenko didn't want to be the person who would personally open the door to a new major escalation. According to analysts, it was the issue of using Belarusian territory that could have been the main topic of the negotiations. Judging by the result, Minsk's answer turned out to be extremely unpleasant for the Kremlin. It's especially interesting that this whole story is happening just a few days after another very telling episode. Lukashenko effectively confirmed that he turned off the repeaters that were used by the Russian side to coordinate drone attacks. Moreover, he openly stated that Belarus should not be dragged into the war. For a man who for years showed almost unconditional loyalty to the Kremlin, such statements sound more than eloquent. And then it got even more interesting. Hardly had the difficult talks with Putin ended when Lukashenko almost instantly found himself in Beijing. Such a quick arrangement of a meeting with Xi Jinping has already been called a separate signal by many experts, when after a difficult talk in the Kremlin, a person's first move is to fly to the Chinese leader. It looks like an attempt to find a very influential interlocutor and at the same time a very serious insurance policy. In Beijing, Lukashenko heard exactly what he wanted to hear. China officially declared its support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Belarus. For diplomats, this is a standard formula. For the Kremlin, it's very unpleasant news as China has effectively drawn a line. Belarus must remain a separate state and not turn into another military testing ground for the implementation of someone else's plans. And here Putin found himself in a rather uncomfortable situation. Just a few years ago, Moscow could dictate the rules of the game to Minsk with almost no alternative. Today, however, Lukashenko has gained a powerful external resource for maneuvering. While the Kremlin demands more involvement in the war, China reminds of stability, trade, transit corridors, and economic interests. And money and logistics have recently sounded much more convincing to Minsk than more military adventures. Beijing has a very simple reason not to allow Belarus to be dragged into a new round of war. China has spent decades building transport routes to Europe, investing in the Belarusian economy, and viewing Minsk as a key hub for its presence on the continent. Any opening of a new front would mean the risk of closed borders, new sanctions, and the destruction of some of these plans. And for the sake of the Kremlin's fantasies about another march on Kyiv, the Chinese leadership clearly isn't going to sacrifice its own interests. Another aspect is no less painful for Moscow. Lukashenko has long since learned to survive between larger players. For years, he balanced between the West and Russia. Now, he is increasingly adding China to this equation. In fact, the Belarusian leader is demonstrating that even in current conditions, he can say no to the Kremlin and not be left alone. Political scientists call Lukashenko a political weather vane for a reason. He rarely takes risks without extreme necessity. He almost never takes a side that he thinks might lose. If Lukashenko is now increasingly showing caution toward the Kremlin's plans, it could signal something very important. Even in Russia's inner circle, fewer people want to link their future to Putin's policies. And this story could go far beyond the Belarusian issue. If China really is becoming more active in the processes surrounding the war, if Beijing is more openly showing its own red lines and the Kremlin's allies are increasingly seeking support there, then Moscow is gradually losing its monopoly on influence even in countries it considered its backyard just yesterday. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about the unity of allies, reality itself presents completely different scenarios. One dictator spends 2 days in the Kremlin, refuses the most important requests, and then flies to Xi Jinping for political cover. For Moscow, this doesn't look like a show of strength. For Moscow, it looks like a very alarming symptom that even its closest partners are looking more closely at a future without Putin.
And also, this same key Kremlin ally panicked and backed down after a tough ultimatum from Kyiv. In Minsk, they seem to have suddenly realized the security of their own territory is much more important than serving Russian attacks. The result was not long in coming. Putin's drones began to rapidly disappear from the usual northern route, completely losing coordination. How did the Ukrainian warning instantly sober up Lukashenko and break the occupiers' aerial logistics? Watch in our report.
The ultimatum worked. Belarus has set its priorities and Moscow is no longer in first place there. Independent observers noticed a rather strange detail. Russian drones, which until very recently were patrolling the Ukrainian-Belarusian border in large numbers, have suddenly vanished from this route. And this happened precisely after a stern statement by Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president openly warned Alexander Lukashenko, if the repeaters and equipment helping Russian drones coordinate strikes on Ukraine are not disabled within a week, Kyiv reserves the right to resolve this issue on its own. The statement was loud, but the events that followed it speak even louder. As recently as late spring and early summer, residents of border areas regularly saw Russian drones over the border. Some of the drones even flew into the territory of Belarus itself. Russian Shaheds used this direction almost as their own private air corridor. But now the situation has changed drastically. Drones continue to attack the Chernihiv region, but now via completely different routes, carefully avoiding the Ukrainian-Belarusian borderlands. Monitoring resources directly suggest the reason may be that the Russians can no longer wish to use part of the Belarusian infrastructure to guide and coordinate their drones. If this version is confirmed, it will look almost like a lightning-fast fulfillment of the ultimatum. And all without loud statements, press conferences, or the traditional stories about brotherly unity. And here, a particularly uncomfortable question arises for Moscow. If a single hint at the possible destruction of critical communication hubs was enough for the Russians to hurriedly reroute their strikes, then how much does the entire long-range attack system actually depend on such facilities? After all, just yesterday, the Kremlin was projecting confidence and claiming virtually unlimited capabilities for its strike campaign. And today, it suddenly turns out that one of the routes has to be shut down in literally a matter of days. It seems that Minsk has also carefully weighed all the risks. Being a rear base for Russian operations is one thing, but turning into a territory containing military targets is quite another. If, following Kyiv's warning, Russian drones have indeed moved away from the Belarusian border, it could be a very telling signal. Even the Kremlin's closest allies are increasingly unwilling to pay their own price for someone else's war. And it seems this is just the beginning of a much broader campaign. Kyiv is moving to a proactive strategy. While the Kremlin feverishly tries to close the sky, in Ukraine there is more and more open talk about striking the very sources of the Russian war machine. Volodymyr Zelensky announced that he has instructed Ukrainian intelligence and the military to act preemptively against facilities that Russia uses to continue and escalate the war. And it seems Moscow understands perfectly well what this is about. Lately, the Russian leadership has been focused primarily on saving itself. According to Zelensky, the Kremlin is literally pulling air defense systems toward Moscow, Valdai, and the Kerch Bridge area, leaving other regions exposed.
In the Moscow region alone, they have deployed hundreds of launchers for S-400, S-500, and Pantsir systems.
While Russian propaganda convinces the public that everything is going according to plan, this very plan involves leaving dozens of regions with minimal protection for the sake of the security of a few particularly important locations. The Kremlin's most valuable resource turned out to be not territory, not industry, and not even strategic facilities. The most valuable resource turned out to be the peace of mind of those living in bunkers and government residences. The situation in Valdai looks even more telling. According to the president of Ukraine, nearly 90 air defense launchers were moved there from other Russian regions, and they are even forming a separate division to protect the country's leadership.
Such are the priorities. They protect their power, they protect the source of this war.
And while hundreds of missile systems guard a narrow circle of people, problems within Russia itself continue to pile up. According to Ukrainian intelligence, more than 60 Russian regions are already facing fuel shortages, and prices for gasoline and diesel are rising rapidly. It's a paradoxical situation. A country that for years boasted of its energy resources is increasingly facing fuel difficulties. But perhaps the most alarming signal for the Kremlin is not coming from oil depots or airfields at all. Zelensky stated that Russian intelligence services are allegedly already discussing postponing or even canceling the September ritual of elections to the State Duma. The reason is simple: too much uncertainty, too many risks, and too many processes that the Kremlin no longer controls as confidently as before. And if only yesterday Moscow was sure that the war would stay far from Russian domestic politics, today it seems that the front is gradually reaching exactly where they feared to see it most, the very system on which Putin's power rests. The more the Kremlin tries to hide the consequences of the war behind the walls of its residences and air defense batteries, the more obvious one simple thing becomes. The strategic initiative has long since ceased to look as unconditionally Russian as propaganda tries to show. And if even the Kremlin's allies are starting to more cautiously assess their own risks, and Russia itself is shifting its last resources to protect Moscow and Putin's inner circle, then the main question is no longer whether the Russian system feels the consequences of the war. The main question is how quickly these consequences will start hitting the very center of decision-making in the Kremlin.
Meanwhile, there's a distinct smell of rebellion in the Kremlin once again. A new wave of a harsh split is brewing under the rug of the Russian system. In Moscow, they still shudder in panic at the mention of Prigozhin's march, and today the bunker dictator fears his inner circle much more than any external enemies. How has animal fear paralyzed the Putin regime? Watch.
What the Kremlin feared after Prigozhin is surfacing once again. A Russian occupier recorded an appeal to Putin and threatened a scenario that Moscow would prefer to erase from its memory forever.
The army will turn its weapons against the Kremlin.
According to the occupier, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are allegedly being held in so-called zindans,
pits and makeshift prisons where they're thrown for refusing to carry out suicidal orders or for conflicts with the command. He claims that soldiers are punished, beaten, forced to hand over money, and the most troublesome ones are simply eliminated. And here an especially uncomfortable question for the Kremlin arises. If all this is just one man's invention, then why was the appeal watched by millions of Russians in just a few days? And if even a part of what was said is true, then we're talking about a much more serious problem. The buildup of discontent within the army itself. Something else is also telling. Until very recently, Russian propaganda convinced society that the army and the government were a single monolith. But the longer the war goes on, the more often stories of conflicts between soldiers and command, of punishments, corruption, and mutual distrust break out. While it's too early to talk about any real mutiny, the very appearance of such statements is very symptomatic. After all, the biggest problems for any government don't start when it's criticized by opponents. The most dangerous moment comes when uncomfortable questions start being asked by their own. Those who just yesterday were called the main pillar of the state. It seems that the ghost of June 2023 still haunts the Kremlin offices. And every time words about weapons aimed towards Moscow are heard from the Russian military, the Kremlin involuntarily remembers how quickly confidence in full control can turn into a frantic search for answers. And here it's worth remembering the words of Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian president recently stated directly that Vladimir Putin is afraid not only of defeat in the war, but most of all, he's afraid of his own army. According to Zelensky, this is exactly why the Kremlin is so desperately clinging to the continuation of the war. After all, the return of hundreds of thousands of soldiers home without a victory could create problems for the Russian government that it fears much more than sanctions or international isolation. If you look at recent events, these words no longer look like a simple political declaration. First, there was Prigozhin's march on Moscow, which showed how unexpectedly the usual control schemes can crumble. Now new appeals from the military are appearing, who openly speak about discontent within the army and even mention the possibility of pointing weapons towards the Kremlin. And here an especially unpleasant dilemma arises for the Russian government. The longer the war continues, the more people pass through the front, gaining their own experience and stop looking at reality through the television. And along with this, the number of those who begin to ask uncomfortable questions to the command and the leadership of the country is growing. Zelensky is convinced that Putin perfectly understands this threat. That is why, according to him, the Russian president is afraid of the end of the war without a declared victory. After all, then it will be necessary to explain to society what the huge losses were for, and to hundreds of thousands of soldiers why all the sacrifices didn't bring the promised result. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about full control over the situation, more and more signals indicate the opposite. The most dangerous challenges for the Kremlin may come not from abroad, but from within the system itself, from people who for years were called the main pillar of the Russian state. And while the Russian military openly threatens the Kremlin, other supporters of the war are beginning to sound the alarm about a completely different problem. It seems more and more people inside Russia itself are starting to worry not about victory at the front, but about what's happening in stores, at gas stations, and in their own wallets. Especially telling was the appeal of the famous Z-blogger Evgeny Golman, a man who is hard to suspect of sympathizing with Ukraine or criticizing the war. But this time even he did not hold back his emotions.
In the country, make sure to tell the president and also inform the Minister of Defense.
In his video, the propagandist effectively called on Russians to prepare for hard times. He advised buying up long-term storage products, stocking up on salt, canned goods, and even mentioned fuel problems in the regions. It sounded as if it wasn't a war supporter speaking to the citizens, but a person preparing for serious economic turbulence. Not long ago, it was these very bloggers who convinced Russians that the economy had withstood the sanctions, industry was working at full capacity, and the country was successfully overcoming all difficulties. Now those same people are suddenly advising to set aside buckwheat, matches, and canned meat. And this looks like a very alarming symptom. Moreover, in his emotional speech, Golman effectively accused the Russian elite of living in a separate reality. Supposedly, while ordinary people are advised to endure and donate money for the war, officials still feel quite comfortable and are not going to give up their usual lifestyle. The Kremlin's biggest problem right now is not Ukrainian drones or even sanctions.
Rats, office rats, how you scurry around.
The biggest problem is that more and more supporters of the system itself are starting to ask questions to which the authorities have no simple answers. And when even the most ardent supporters of the war advise stocking up on buckwheat and preparing for a difficult autumn, it already looks like a signal far more serious than any official reports on stability.
What do you think about these events? Share your opinion in the comments, leave a like, and stay informed. More to come.